Hello there, it's Dr. Ken with a lecture for my Chaucer's England class that I'm titling Secular Space. So in this we'll be talking about, last week of course we talked about the church and its space in the medieval world. Now we're talking about the secular realm a bit more. And the first slide that you'll be seeing there shows you W.G. Hoskyns' book, The Making of the English Landscape. And it asks you, and I'm sort of challenging you to think about landscape as a primary source. What can it reveal, right? So it can be a source for social, cultural, and economic history. Place names are often an indication of something or another. Where we are in the Northeast, there are a lot of place names that have Viking elements to them, and this refers to an earlier period in our history. The names of fields, right? Sometimes fields have names and they can indicate earlier aspects of that place's history. Road patterns, settlement patterns, town and village layouts, map interpretation, all these things can yield volumes of information on a landscape. You'll be seeing some images in the slides showing some fields but with indentations on the surface. Which can only really be appreciated from above, so like an aerial view in a helicopter or aeroplane, or from a drone. And these reveal earlier constructions on those sites, which could be anything from a Roman villa to a medieval manor house. So Hoskyns' book discusses how the English landscape reveals its past and can be used as a primary source. And for those of you who are interested in this sort of thing, that's a good source to look at. Our lecture themes for today deal with things like economy, industry, the status and how it's represented in the landscape, towns, but also the countryside, including the deserted medieval villages, of which we know there are more than 6,000. We'll talk about those a bit more. I'll show you some examples from one that's not too far away from us. And we'll think about plowing and what we know about and farming generally, and talk a bit about Piers Plowman. So, economy and industry, right, in the landscape. We know that thanks to a number of factors in the 14th century, it is an economy with a disposable income. The amount of money in circulation hugely increased in this period. We know that from before the Norman invasion, there had been around 50,000 pounds in circulation as coin. That's 50,000 pounds in their terms, which would be a bit more today, but still. And by 1311, this had risen more to closer to 1 million pounds. At any particular point in time, though, much of the currency might be either stored away or being used to support military campaigns. And so we talked about this before, how there's a kind of churning of money when a military campaign is about to happen. There's a kind of the money recedes like a tide, the king collecting it to pay his soldiers. He pays them, it goes back out again, circulates for a bit, but then they go off, and they might be spending some of that money elsewhere, or they might come back penniless, or they might come back with more money. So it's a kind of haphazard process. And of course, what's changing from the earlier medieval period to the current one is that the economy, as we've seen, is becoming more monetarily based and less based on labor as a means of exchange. So it had traditionally been based on labor. There appears to be an improved standard of living for those who survive the Black Death. Higher wages are available, again thanks to the demand for laborers. The economic consequences of the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt varied considerably from region to region, but generally London, the South, and the West prospered at the expense of the eastern and older cities in the North, interestingly enough. Mercantilism is really beginning to take off during this period, and it's based heavily on the wool trade. Both pre-industries, that is mercantilism itself broadly, and the wool trade are based on English raw wool exports. Rivaled only, we're told, by the sheepwalks of Castile, which were famous, that developed from the 15th century. There's a significant source of income for the crown in taxation from from wool trade, and from 1275 the crown imposed an export tax on wool called the Great Custom. The importance of wool to the English economy can be shown by the fact that since the 14th century and to the present day, the presiding officer of the House of Lords has sat on what's called the wool sack, a chair stuffed with wool, symbolically to remind him of the importance of it. And as we'll see, part of the reason for the abandonment of a lot of villages has less to do with the plague and more to do with the nobles turning to raising wool. More land, much of it at the expense of the royal forest, was brought into production to feed the growing population or to produce wool for export to France, to Europe more broadly. Cloth manufacture in England increasingly dominated European markets up to the 15th and 16th centuries. England exported almost no cloth at all in 1347, but by 1400 around 40,000 bales of cloth a year were being exported. The trade reached its first peak in 1447, with exports reaching 60,000. The wool and cloth trade was primarily now being run by English merchants themselves rather than by foreigners. Increasingly, the trade was also passing through London and the ports of the southwest. By the 1360s, 66 to 75% of the export trade was in English hands, and by the 15th century this had risen to 80%. London managed around 50% of these exports in 1400 and as much as 83% of the wool and cloth exports by 1540. So, as I say, more land is being turned over to the production of, particularly of wool, but also other things. We've seen how trade was organized into the form of guilds, right? Guilds being an association of craftsmen and merchants formed for mutual aid and protection for the furtherance of their professional careers and interest. These guilds flourished in Europe between the 11th and the 16th century and formed an important part of the economic and social fabric of any given area. The medieval guilds were generally one of two types: merchant guilds or craft guilds. We've seen, of course, also religious guilds, as well. Merchant guilds were associations of most of the merchants in a particular town or city, a bit like a chamber of commerce, maybe. These men might be local, and they could sometimes be women too, long distance traders, wholesale or retail sellers, and might deal in various categories of goods. Craft guilds, and we're more familiar with those, were occupational associations that usually comprised all the artisans or craftsmen of a particular type in a particular town. And there were guilds of weavers, dyers, fullers. Fullers are part of the dyeing process, preparing the cloth for dyeing. In the wool trade, there were masons and architects in the building trade, guilds of painters, metalsmiths, blacksmiths, bakers, butchers, leather workers, soap makers, and so on. These guilds performed a variety of important functions in the local economy. They established a monopoly of trade in their locality or within a particular branch of industry or commerce. They set and maintained standards for the quality of goods and the integrity of trading practices in the industry. They worked to maintain stable prices for their goods and commodities, and they sought to control town or city governments in order to further the interests of the guild members and achieve their objectives. They were fundamentally conservative and about maintaining a kind of status quo, but to ensure the employment of their members. The first English guilds emerged during about the 12th century, although we have evidence of them from earlier. These were fraternities of craftsmen setting out to manage their local affairs, including things like prices, as I say, workmanship, the welfare of workers too. That was a big part of the guilds, and the suppression of interlopers and, as they call them, sharp practices, that is to say, undercutting quality for price. Amongst these early guilds, the guild's merchants existed, who ran the local markets in town and represented the merchant community in discussions with the crown. Other early guilds included craft guilds, as I've said, in specific trades. By 1130, there were major weavers' guilds in 6 English towns, as well as a fullers' guild in Winchester. Over the following decades, more guilds were created, often because of becoming increasingly involved in both local and national politics. although the guild merchants were largely replaced by official groups established under new royal charters called the livery companies. I'll come back to those in a bit. The craft guilds required relatively stable markets and a relative equality of income and opportunity amongst their members to function effectively. By the 14th century, these conditions were increasingly uncommon. The first strains were seen in London, where the old guild system began to collapse. More and more trade was being conducted at the national level, making it hard for craftsmen to both manufacture goods and to trade in them. And there was growing disparity in incomes between the richer and the poorer craftsmen. As a result, under Edward III, many guilds became companies or livery companies. These are chartered companies focusing on trade and finance, leaving the guild structure to represent the interest of the smaller, poorer manufacturers. So the guilds are still around, but the largest of them went on to become these livery companies. And they are the forerunners of modern corporations. So relaxation in laws regarding usury began to have an impact as well during the 14th century. Originally, this is charging interest on loans, including charging a fee for the use of money, like at a bureau de change. In places where interest became acceptable, usury was interest above the rate allowed by law. In England, the departing Crusaders were joined by crowds of debtors in the massacre of the Jews at London and York, and we saw this before. That happened in 1189 to 90. But in 1275, Edward I of England passed the Statute of Jewry, and we saw how this kicked out the Jews, and this happened all over Europe as well. The Jews, of course, were the ones who were allowed to loan money at interest because they weren't Christian, and this is why the king kept them around. But with their going, and of course there was an initial glut of resource from having seized their assets. After they'd gone, though, a gap was observed. A vacuum had been left in the market. There needed to be loaning money at interest. So from that time, gradually, and certainly by the 14th century, it's much more common, usury is the rules against usury are relaxed, meaning that the kind of more modern kind of finance could take place, and this facilitated the growth of the livery companies. The role of merchants in trade became increasingly seen as important to the country. Usury gradually became more widely accepted, with English economic thinking increasingly influenced by later Renaissance humanist theories. And the growth of the number of the chartered trading companies in London, such as the Worshipful Company of Drapers or the Company of Merchant Adventurers of London, continued, and English producers began to provide credit to European buyers, rather than the other way around, which had been the case initially. Usury grew during the period. In few cases were prosecuted by the authorities. It seems to have been decriminalization by stealth over time. That's going on. There's a changing industrial and social, or rather the industrial and social relationships are changing after the Black Death. In the decades following the disaster, the economic and social issues arising from the Black Death combined with the cost of the 100 Years' War to produce the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. That's an oversimplification, but it's accurate, I think. The revolt was suppressed, but it undermined many of the vestiges of the feudal economic order, and the countryside ceased to be more manorial and was dominated by estates organized as farms, raising a cash crop of some kind, and usually sheep. And these were often rented by the new economic class of the gentry. So lots of changes taking place economically for a long time, very few changes, and then the guilds emerge, and then the monetary economy takes off, and everything shifts. With the increased wealth of individuals, there is a change of status that is observable in the landscape. Certain features are designed to dominate the landscape, so castles, obviously, abbeys and monasteries, parish churches. They can often be seen from a long way away. They indicate status, authority, centers of government, centers of officialdom, And that's partly the point. They're meant to impress. Um, since this is a period that we're looking at, the 14th century, of somewhat greater peace, there's a tendency to aggrandize these buildings and use them less for fortification, as they had previously been used for, and more for proclaiming the status of whoever built them, and for whether the church or individuals, particularly individuals. Um, so in terms of other aspects of status in the landscape, we can talk about the importance of fairs and markets. Uh, so trade is everywhere regulated, right? In England, a charter fair in England is a street fair or market which was established by royal charter. Many charter fairs date back to the Middle Ages, and their heyday was the 13th century. They begin to go into decline in the 14th, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Originally, most charter fairs started as street markets. And toward the end of the medieval period, the position of fairs declined. One important shift was that the major merchants, particularly in London, began to establish commercial primacy by the 14th century over the larger magnate customers, rather than the magnates buying from chartered fairs. So traditionally, the fair had served as a kind of trading venue, locally and more broadly. But with this sort of ramping up of economic activity, trade becomes again something a bit more modern. New towns were certainly planned and usually located with access to trade routes in mind rather than defense, and the streets were laid out to make access to the town's market convenient. So a change again from the old medieval fortified town with a wall around it to defend against Vikings or Anglo-Saxons or whatever, depending on the era we're talking about, or Normans, to a town being designed around a market or around access to trade. The market supplied goods to the town and the surrounding parishes. The guild merchants ran the local markets in town and represented the merchant community in discussions with the crown. Towns had weekly markets, and usually an annual fair as well. Fairs lasted around 3 days and were major events with people and goods coming from afar. And the fairs presented the opportunity to purchase exotic items such as foreign spices and silks, as well as for merchants to buy goods wholesale. As I say, towards the end of the period, the position of fairs began to drop or decline. One important shift was that, as I say, major merchants were starting to establish more modern commercial type activities. As an example of the shift, the household accounts of Henry III show that the monarch bought 75% of his requirements from the great fairs. Right? By the time of Edward II, the majority were being bought directly from the major merchants. The rise of international trading confederations, such as the Hanseatic League during the 15th century, improved communication and the growth of larger English merchant classes in the major cities, especially London, which gradually eroded the value of the chartered fairs. Foreign merchants, upon whom the great chartered fairs had come to some extent depended for getting these exotic goods, were being crowded out by English merchants, particularly in critical areas such as the cloth trade. The control of the crown over trade in the towns, especially the emerging newer towns that lacked central civic government, was increasingly weaker, making chartered status less relevant, or more as more trade occurred from private properties and took place all year round. So you were getting businesses, we're getting shops, those sorts of things. Nevertheless, the great fairs remained of some importance well into the 15th century, as illustrated by their role in exchanging money, regional commerce, and in providing choice for individual customers. The evolution of the canal and eventually the railway system in England during the 19th century finally pushed the fair system to near extinction, although in recent years many have been revived as kind of cultural rather than primarily economic events. I remember when I was in St Andrews, every summer there was something called the Lammas Fair, where one whole street of the town, a street called Market Street actually, was taken over by a fair that would come in to sell things. Basically, there were rides, there were things for the kids as well, but it was basically selling often exotic or unusual goods. So that's a remnant of that. They're still around, they still occur, but they're not nearly as common as they once were. Well, with increased trade and the importance of trade, road networks become very important during this period. So they're a major feature of secular space, although they also figure into um, sacred space as well. So the road system in England in the Middle Ages, and indeed to this day, was based on a network of Roman roads. Originally, the Romans laid about 1,000 miles of road, plus or minus. We're not entirely sure the exact amount. By the Middle Ages, by about 1360, there were 3,000 miles, roughly 3,000 miles of road, with only 10% of them being exclusively Roman roads. So they're building on this. The highway network connected into local networks of streets, alleys, lanes between enclosed fields, lanes between manors, village roads, portways, and these are for carrying goods, and cartways, and there were monastic roads as well to connect up different religious sites. Good stone bridges are relatively scarce. Most bridges are wooden, but they're beginning to make more. There's a special type of tax called pontage, which is a temporary tax for repairing bridges. And so the idea would be if you crossed over, it's like a toll. If you crossed over a bridge, you might have to pay this tax to someone waiting there to take it up, or there might be a tax levied in an area for bridges. Medieval Europe had very poor roads. Potholes could be large enough to overturn a cart. In wet weather, the roads became extremely muddy. It wasn't until the late 14th century that city streets became cobbled with stones. So during most of the period of Chaucer's England that we're thinking about, the streets weren't cobbled. They were basically dirt roads. There might be gravel on some of them, but they weren't streets as we think of them. Shipping by sea or river was far more efficient than land carting. Old Roman roads have remained in use, but there's also a growing network of other routes linking communities and market centers. All classes of society would use these routes: royalty, nobility, and clergy, merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, peddlers, and drovers. Even the most well-used routes might not be defined clearly on the ground, especially where they crossed unenclosed heaths, commons, or forests, in sparsely populated areas. There was little road engineering really in the medieval period, and no national system for road clearing and maintenance. The king would remind local lords and churchmen of their responsibility to maintain his highway, and maintenance could also be part of manorial agreements. Tolls and gifts or legacies from wealthy merchants might also contribute to the upkeep of roads. It was very haphazard, though, very patchy. Maintenance was patchy. The most significant construction work was bridges over important rivers, usually in wood at first and later in stone. Elsewhere, fords and ferries were maintained to cross rivers, although holdups could occur at times of bad weather and flooding. Occasionally, rough causeways were raised across floodplains as well. New tracks used ridges or followed hillside contours above valleys. Travelers had the right to pass over cultivated land if the usual route was impassable. By 1200, the Exchequer and Chancery were permanently based in London, and there was a need to deliver urgent documents to the king and his court as it traveled around the country. And the king and court traveled; it was itinerant at that point. Messengers, but the treasury was in London, so messengers changed horses regularly to achieve the greatest speed, and this is the origin of the postal system. The idea is that the roads have to be maintained so that the king's business can be undertaken throughout the land, but again, it was very haphazard and doesn't really begin to take on a more structured form until the end of the 14th century. Ports are of course important, especially thanks to the international trade in wool. Much of this trade was with France and the Low Countries and Germany, but the northeast of England traded with partners as far away as Sweden and other Scandinavian states. England might not be the most important trading nation in Christendom, but its economic links reached from Ireland to Portugal, Constantinople, and Moscow. London was England's most important trading port during the 14th century because of its excellent position on the tidal stretches of the Thames, its large population, which was about up to 100,000 prior to the Black Death in 1348, and the skill and wealth of its merchants and traders. Other areas, too, were important ports. It's strange of us to think so, but Yarm was actually quite an important port on the river, and other places in the Tees Valley served as important ports during the Middle Ages that are not so important now. York will have been another one. So part of this developing trade that's going on more broadly, but including in England, was the Hanseatic League. This was an economic alliance of trading cities and their guilds that dominated trade along the coast of northern Europe in the later Middle Ages. It stretched from the Baltic Sea to the North Sea and inland during the late medieval period and early modern. So from the 13th century to the 17th century, the Hanseatic League exists. And the map, as you can see, shows it roughly around 1400 and the sort of cities and countries involved. The Hanseatic cities had their own legal system and furnished their own protection and mutual aid, and thus established a sort of political autonomy, and in some cases created political entities of their own. Yet the League never became a closely managed or formal organization. Assemblies of the Hanseatic towns met irregularly in Lübeck, and the Hansetag or Hanseatic Diet was its parliament or assembly from 1356 onwards, but many towns chose not to send representatives and decisions weren't binding on individual cities. Over time, the network of alliances grew to include a flexible roster of between 70 and 170 different cities. So it's kind of like an early EU or early EEC or something like that, an economic zone consisting of a number of cities who by mutual agreement engage in regular trade with each other. It wasn't so much a league of cities as it was a league of merchant associations within those cities in northern Germany and the Baltic. Trade in the Middle Ages was dangerous and risky. Business was dangerous and risky business, and the only way for merchants to protect themselves was by traveling together. This banding together of merchants on the road led to their alliances at home as well. And in the case of the Hanseatic League, the impetus for its formulation was trade along the Kiel Salt Road, which didn't run between Kiel and Lübeck, but between Hamburg and Lübeck, but was named after the town where the salt was mined. Founded in the 12th century by an alliance of these northern towns, which Hamburg and Lübeck, which lay on the opposite sides of the base of the Danish peninsula. They involved a number of cities in places like Sweden and Danish territory as well. And as I say, the Diet or the Hansetag, their assembly met, but it seems to have been more like a convention rather than an actual governing body. Whilst most of the cities in the Hansa were within the domains of the local feudal lords, and the citizens of these cities were feudal vassals, Lübeck, for example, was one of the free cities, or more properly, it was an imperial city which owed its allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor alone. This in itself gave Lübeck an advantage over many other cities, which allowed them to undertake this sort of trade. So cities themselves are kind of a novel thing at this time, because villages and towns are often part of some medieval manor, but something large enough like a city like London or York was in effect incorporated itself and governed itself, subject albeit to the king or whatever the equivalent was. But this led to innovation, the trading Hansa, particularly in terms of an innovative new ship design, something called the Baltic cog. Before the development of the cog, ships in the north of Europe were built on the same design as the Viking ships of old. They were strong and seaworthy, but could handle only limited amounts of cargo. And with the creation of the Baltic cog, which has a kind of was clinker built, made of timber from the forest of Novgorod and other northern cities, flat bottomed with a center mounted rudder. This was a technical advance for the period. It meant that it could go into the shallows of the Baltic and North Sea, but also into rivers as well. It didn't scrape the bottom, but it could also contain a lot of cargo. So a Baltic cog. So in terms of the units they used, a Viking ship, the standard old, based on the Viking design, could hold about 20 lasts. A last is a measure of volume, being roughly equivalent to 2 metric tons. A Baltic cog, on the other hand, could hold between 50 to 200 lasts, and on average, depending on the size of the ship, it was about 100. So that's a step change. That's a major increase in the amount of cargo they're able to carry. It could be fitted with a removable keel. It held one mast with a square-rigged sail. Their flat bottoms meant that they were fitted for sailing in shallow waters, a design factor still used by small sailing ships in places like the Netherlands. These were rugged. They held a lot of cargo and sailed like barges compared to the sleek Viking design. They also had disadvantages because of their square-rigged sail, of not being able to tack into the wind, but they followed the natural currents and winds in the North and Baltic seas, so they didn't need to tack. And certain other instruments are being developed as well around this time. So the astrolabe, and we know that Chaucer, of course, wrote on the astrolabe to facilitate sea trade. Even so, navigation was difficult, and their navigational charts usually contained a kind of description of the coastline. So they would aim for their target coastlines and then use that chart, which would just be like a visual representation, to indicate where, to give them some sense of where they were. There was no way to calculate longitude. They simply had to rely on landmarks. And in addition to the difficulty of navigation, piracy was a very real issue. Even so, it was safer to sail than it was to go by land because of brigands and thieves. Because of the dangers involved with shipping cargo, especially since there was no such thing as insurance, the common practice was to form partnerships. There actually had been insurance. The Greeks and Romans had it, but it seems to have been forgotten. Anyway, pardon me. The common practice was to form partnerships and have each merchant buy a share of a cargo or a share of a ship. And by spreading their investment over several cargoes and shipping them on several ships, the risk of catastrophic loss was reduced. This is sometimes referred to as bottomry. On land, so the ships have come with their cargo through the Hanseatic League or wherever. They've got to unload. On land, the merchant would operate what was called a factory. It's not what we think of as a factory. You can see an example of it there in the slide. It wasn't a place to manufacture things, but it was usually a three-storied structure containing on its lowest level the retail outlet where buying and selling of the goods took place. On the second floor was a warehouse where the things were stored, so you'll see there's a crane to lift stuff up to the second story, and also to protect it, made it safer there. And on the topmost floor would be an office and living quarters. In the Hanseatic League, these were called counters, and the counters were basically trading posts, or a version of this were known as counters. Trading posts, though the most important, were elaborate and may have involved whole neighborhoods. The 5 major foreign counters were at Wisby, the island of Gotland, the counter in Novgorod, a Norwegian one in Bergen, one in Bruges, and one in London. So these were like the headquarters, the main trading headquarters of the Hanse. There would be smaller ones all throughout. You can bet there would be one at Yarm somewhere, and anywhere else there was a port. But the big ones, the ones that were connected with the League, were in these cities. In order to be eligible to work in one of the foreign counters, a merchant had to be a married man of good reputation and to make a commitment to serve there for a full year, since the convoys were annual, depending on that, again, the ocean currents sea currents rather, and the winds. So this is going on at the time. It's a major step towards international trade. It makes a lot of people rich. It encourages a monetary economy and commerce. And as a result of all this monetary economy and commerce, towns are growing. There are 540 towns in England in 1377. Only 4 have a population of over 8,000. They are London, York, Bristol, and Coventry, although Lincoln is up there too. It's quite close. And they're not much more than that. They're actually quite small by modern standards. They're not densely built up, rather haphazard in design as well. One of the reasons that the king wanted the peasants out of London during the Peasants' Revolt was because things were wooden and rather, in some cases, shoddily built. There was a real fear of fire. As today, the towns are dependent on imported foodstuffs from the countryside or further abroad. Town walls, which had often been built in earlier periods, could constrain development. So if you go to a place today like York, or my former home of St Andrews, where there's a medieval wall still in place, you can see how the town has spread beyond it like a plant spreading its roots outward. They had very poor sanitation, and waste disposal led to reduced life expectancy. They had open sewers, basically, and each town had literally what was called Shit Creek, which you can imagine, it's an open sewer draining people's waste that's just dumped into this outside the town. English towns are organized according to what are called burgage plots. And this is kind of the urban equivalent of a manorial property. So for urban property, this was established early in the medieval period. It was based primarily on tenants paying cash, though, rather than providing labor services. So you have a landlord, a bit like a lord of a manor. These are more expensive, of course, than in the countryside. As today, properties in London are very, very dear. As the populations grew, burgage plots could be split into smaller additional units. Burgage tenures were usually monetarily based, in contrast to the rural ones, which were traditionally based on labor and services rendered. Further development of a set of taxes that could be raised by the towns included murage for walls, pavage for streets, and pontage for bridges and for the repair of bridges. Towns had bridges too. Combined with the lex mercatoria, which was a set of codes and customary practices governing trading, these provided a reasonable basis for the economic governance of the towns. It's a different sort of system than the countryside. It requires on a different principle of labor and exchange of commodities and capital. So you can see an example of burgage plots there in the slide, how the town will be divided up. It still retains a kind of element of a manorial feudal system, but it's had to evolve and become something, again, a bit more modern. What about the countryside, right? It still exists, obviously. It's still a feudal landscape. You have manors and manor houses, and you'll be seeing some examples there. Manor houses are often defensive in design. By the 13th century, the fortified manor house had emerged, not quite a castle, yet more advanced than the Saxon hall. These early fortified manors were built in brick or stone with a timber roof. Fire was still open, and the hall was still the abode of servants and retainers, but now a new room was added, the solar. This is the development of the manorial house. So the solar, what is that? It's a private room for the lord and his family, usually on the first floor, and reached from a raised dais at one end of the hall. The space beneath the solar was often given over to storage. So like a living room, but solar meaning that it had a lot of sunlight. At the other end of the hall from the solar was the kitchen area, usually separated from the main hall by wooden screens. Over time, the kitchen became a totally separate room, often arranged at right angles to the main hall. The main entrance to the manor was at the kitchen end. Window space was at a minimum to be in the fortified manor, and outer defenses may have included a moat with a gatehouse reached by a drawbridge. In the 14th century, the manor house became more elaborate. More elaborate room additions appeared. The buttery for food storage appeared between the kitchens and the main hall. Above the buttery was a guest room, further evidence of the growing awareness of and interest in personal privacy. The simple entrance of the earlier century became a more elaborate porch over which could appear a gallery for musicians, keep them separated. They're of a lower class, you see, but also for acoustic reasons. The various rooms, the solar, the hall, the buttery, the kitchen, and have their own separate roofs, often at right angles to each other. And again, you're seeing some examples here. Though the most desirable building material was still stone for those who could afford it, bricks made an appearance, particularly in East Anglia. Buildings are usually constructed of local stone and imposed on the landscape. But they can also be, and castles can often be, the genesis of new towns. So you'll see an example there. There's an example of a town where there was a castle, a heavily fortified medieval castle. And of course, a castle requires blacksmiths. It requires serfs to work the land, to feed them. It requires all sorts of things. As the defensive importance of the castle decreases, a town may grow around it. Or the town may start off by supplying goods to the castle, but then take on a kind of economic life of its own. So, in terms of the feudal manor, right, we've talked about this and how it's a service-based system, a labor-based economy, relationships maintained through the manorial courts, consolidated through local customs. The manorial lord is, in effect, the local sovereign. So who would we find in these places? Well, we know villeins, right? We call them peasants today. Usually tied to the land they worked on. Serf is the more common word used, which comes from the Latin word servius, meaning slave. A servus. A villain couldn't leave the land without the landowner's consent. They thus occupied the social space between a free peasant and a slave. The majority of medieval European peasants were probably villains, but not all of them were tied to the land, and there are different classes of them. We've seen franklins and yeomen, right, the upper end of the spectrum. There are also borders and cottars. So this is a lower class of villains known as borders or cottars, and they occupied a very, very small plot of land for personal use, which, like villains, they didn't own, but for which they had to pay rent and or labor services. Although they constituted about 1/3 of the population, they only occupied about 5% of the land. So these are the poorest, maybe, if you like. A freeman, right? A medieval freeman was a person who was given some land in return for services to the king. A freeman had 15 strips of land in each field, but in return he had to work to pay for it. He had to help with the plowing and at harvest and help give out duties to peasants. A freeman could leave the site without permission of the manor lord and could marry anyone, even from a different manor, without having to pay those fines. So moving up the ladder a bit. Another class of freemen is known as the sokemen, or sumen sometimes they're called. Roughly about 1 in 6 of the population were sokemen. They owned about 20% of the land. And they were especially numerous in East Anglia for some reason. Sokemen held a sokage, as it's called. They had security of tenure, provided they carried out certain defined services, and often including light labor services and or paying a fixed rent. They could inherit land. So there are lots of little degrees of difference between the types of villain that existed. And as I say, technically the yeomen, the franklins, the higher end of the scale are also villains, but they're not bound to a manor. And there's some question of where allegiance was located. Was it to the lord? Was it to the parish? Because the parish is often the same as the manor, and the church has a great deal of authority. So it's harder for us maybe to think about these things and understand them in the way they did. I'm sure they probably didn't have much of a conflict between where allegiance lay, but To us, maybe it seems unclear. Open fields. So what you're seeing is an image of a medieval field, the rig and furrow, or ridge and furrow design. It was called rig and furrow in the Northeast. It's very different from what we're accustomed to today. So we're accustomed to a large patchwork, square fields. They had strips known as cellions. So usually a manor consisted of the manor house, a church, and other houses at the center, along with arable land for farming, meadow and pasture land in rotation. And it's farmed in strips, as I say, the ridge and furrow design. So, as I say, known in the Northeast as rig and furrow. It's a type of earthwork found in fields. It gives the surface of the ground a wavy, corrugated effect, like corduroy. They were arranged in blocks, which reflected the shape of old fields, and seen from the air, the ridges are often slightly S-shaped, a result of horse plowing techniques. And a bank or headland would grow at the end of the rows where the plow turns. Sometimes the old field boundaries have survived. In other cases, ridge and furrow is cut and crossed by more modern field boundaries, but you can still see it often from above. It's now a relic of an obsolete type of farming, obviously. The pattern of the ridges and furrows is often all that remains of the narrow strips called cellions, as I say, that use the open field system of agriculture. This was a communal method of strip farming in large village areas, which has its origins in the early medieval period, about 800 to 1200 A.D., and which continued in some areas up until the early 19th century. It's still practiced in some places, but mainly as a kind of relic or museum type affair. It was largely destroyed by the Enclosure Act the enclosure into smaller shaped fields, a process which peaked in the 18th and 19th centuries. Only one working example of an open field system remains at Laxton, Nottinghamshire, in the Cheviot Hills in Northumberland. A prehistoric version called cord rig has also been identified. There are practical advantages to creating these ridges. They increase soil depth and add to the overall surface area of the field, and the furrow between assists drainage, so that the crops will be planted on the ridge, and the furrow facilitates drainage between them. Almost every part of England had some examples, if not countless ones, such as in Northumberland. Rig and furrow is visible across wide areas of the countryside to this day, where it used to be. In East Oxford, the remains of this type of farming can be seen at South Park, but in many areas they've been ploughed out and have entirely disappeared or survived only as sort of visible marks on the soil and very slight earthworks. This may have happened in the recent past, and many now vanished examples are visible in aerial photographs taken in the 1940s and 60s, and you'll be seeing some of those here. Remember that land that's not being cultivated is held in common. Even if it belongs to the king, there will be manorial rights for accessing it. The woodland makes up about 7% of the land at this point. It's a vital resource, and we've seen how it was used already, but I'll just go over some of these details again. Firewood, right? Building materials like timber. These are really important. The manorial lord grants the right to gather firewood to tenants, parish churches, etc. Pardon me. So there's often shared access between the churches and ordinary people. Wood pasturage occurs, right? So we've talked about pannage. This gave certain areas of the forest over to medieval, to people with their pigs. They could graze in the forest at certain times of year when the acorns fell. The 9-week pannage season was originally fixed between the 25th of September and the 22nd of November. And these are part of the customary rights that people have, even though they can't hunt in the New Forest. These belong to the king. The king's animals are there. It's illegal to hunt his deer without his permission, but certain resources from the forest may be taken at different times. Coppicing is another example of this, and this is cutting back of any free tree or shrub, rather, with the idea of letting it grow again. to provide a fresh crop of wood that can be cut once more, so a renewable resource. Coppicing then takes advantage of the fact that most broadleaf trees will regrow if cut down. Some of them actually grow better. Coppicing can actually be quite good for some plants, so it's a way of maintaining, of managing the resources in an area. It actually prolongs their lives, apparently. Another aspect of secular space is the deserted medieval village. So there is a huge population expansion in England before the Black Death. At its height, the population is estimated around 6 or 7 million in England and Wales. The Black Death is thought to have killed between 45 and 60% of the local population. We know this is a result of you know, Little Ice Age and the Great Famine as well, along with the Black Death. So previously they've been cultivating marginal lands that were not really that good for farming, but they had to feed this surplus population. So villages grew. They were like satellites of smaller towns, farming the land for food to feed the surplus population. At the beginning of the 14th century, the onset of the Little Ice Age brings the Great Famine. That's step one of abandoning these villages. And the next, of course, is the Black Death. Little Ice Age and the Great Famine occur about 1315 to 17, and probably killed about 10% of the population. This is before the Black Death. New town, because people are abandoning these villages, new towns, villages, and farmsteads are formed as many older ones disappear. The Black Death meant a retreat from marginal cultivation. It wasn't just the Black Death, it was also the increase in the wool trade. 3,000 plus, we think actually closer to 6,000 plus medieval villages were abandoned from either the Black Death, the Great Famine, or the turning over the land for wool. The Little Ice Age made a lot of the land non-viable, but then, as I say, the lords were often turning it over to the wool trade. You'll be seeing, well, I'll show you some pictures in a bit of, come back to that, Warren Percy. How can we tell where a medieval village used to be? Well, one way to tell might be if its name is mentioned in the Doomsday Book, right? And there's nothing there now. So that's an indication there was something there at the time of William the Conqueror or in a later edition of it, and it's now gone. Field names and place names sometimes give evidence. The presence of rig and furrow or ridge and furrow farming in some of these places too, that's an indication. And small ruins, remnants of churches or other buildings, and you can see some examples here in places where there's nothing else. That's clearly a sign of an abandoned village. Evidence like pottery or masonry, grassy banks over house plots, evidence of ancient trackways that have overgrown. Concentrations of nettles even in some places, and again from the air, outlines on the landscape that indicate where these things existed. So if you're traveling about and you see, what looks like the ruin of a church or some other structure in the middle of a field, it's probably where a village was that's been abandoned. So you'll see now an example of one, Wolfhamscote in Warwickshire, and you can see where the outline of the field is present, on the landscape. So the outline of the old whatever was there, the town or village was there in the landscape. And I'll show you one a bit closer to home. This is Horham Percy, which is relatively close to us. It's not far at all. It's just sort of to the south of here, sort of between Scarborough and York. And it's one that we know was abandoned not because of the Black Death, although the Black Death devastated it. It was abandoned because the owners, the Percy family, that is the Earls of Alnwick, Percys of Alnwick, Earls of Northumberland, gave it over to sheep farming. And this is the case with a lot of them as well. It's not just about the Black Death, it's about economics and the changing economics of the time. So, how did they plow these fields? Well, it comes. We know what a medieval plow was like, based largely on images that have survived, and in no small part from one of the books that we have that illustrated the Luttrell Psalter. So each strip in the Middle Ages was managed by one small family with large common fields, and the location of the plowing was more or less the same each year. The movement of soil year after year gradually built up the center of the strip into a ridge, leaving the dip or furrow between each ridge. Note that the use of furrow here is different from that of the furrow left by the plow. So the furrow is the bit in between. The building up of a ridge was called filling or gathering. This was sometimes done before plowing began. It's thought that the raised ridges offered better drainage, and they probably did. The dip often marked the boundary between the plots. They used a 3-crop rotation. Individual furlongs, and this is again another name for the cellions, the strips that they plowed, were left fallow every second or third year. Two of every 3 would be planted with wheat, oats, or barley. The third would be left fallow and used for animal grazing, so the animals are putting back into the land nutrients that have been taken out of it. And as I say, a furlong, the word furlong comes from furlong. It's the length of a medieval field, which is about an acre in length. The furlong was also known as a flat, a furshot, or sometimes a sheth. The length varied depending on the type of soil. It was used for horses to take. It was a custom for them to take a short breather at the end of the furlong before turning to the next furrow. So in many ways, it's naturally defined by when the horse gets tired, it has to take a break. The heavier the soil, the harder the horses had to work, and so the less time between breathers. This led to shorter furlongs or furrows between the ends, and therefore local variations in furlong length. The coulter of the plow cut a thin strip in the turf. The plowshare would slice into the soil. This is talking about the plow itself, and you're seeing an example of that in the image. So the coulter cut the furrow. The plowshare would slice into the soil, and then the soil would ride up the mold board, which would then turn it over. And we know as much about this as we do, in no small part thanks to Sir Geoffrey Luttrell and his Psalter. This is one of these books that a private individual is using for lay devotion, but also for showing off his status. So Sir Geoffrey Luttrell from Irnham in Lincolnshire, 1320 to 1345, was a wealthy English landowner. He commissioned the Luttrell Psalter, the illustrations of which include a representation of him, as you can see in the image, his wife, and his daughter-in-law. Only he owned this valuable book, as it was the only copy. It was again for his soul, but it was also for his status. The Psalter is an illuminated manuscript written and illustrated circa 1320 to 40 by an anonymous scribe and artist. Along with the Psalms, it contains a calendar, a mass, and a song for the dead. The pages vary to their degree of illumination, but are richly covered with both decorated text and marginal pictures of saints and Bible stories, but stories of rural life and farming, cooking, doctoring, spouses squabbling, musicians playing, etc. It's considered by some to be one of the richest sources for visual depictions of everyday rural life in England of the Middle Ages. The illustrations include many strange combinations of parts of animals and human figures, grotesques. We'll talk about those a bit more next time. Most remain obscure, but some can be related to the text. And why is he putting these sort of things in there? Does it depict an imaginary golden age? Is it reasserting the fading values of the Middle Ages? Is it Sir Geoffrey Luttrell just being thankful for the wealth he has and pointing out the ways he's getting it? Well, look at some of the images you can see from this. There's plowing, and then there's a very, very good illustration of a medieval plow. sheep farming naturally, woman feeding birds, plowing, or sorry, sowing seeds, harvesting crops. There you see oxen, the team of oxen um, connected to the plow. I've put in the notes a number of the things that are depicted in this. They're very high quality images, so we get a good sense of what people are wearing, um, and what kind of clothes they wore, what kind of animals they used, how they undertook the farming. It's a really useful source for these sorts of things. And on the subject of plowmen, I'll just conclude talking a little bit about Piers Plowman. We discussed this already, but worth pointing out that the version that we have of it, it tells a kind of allegorical tale about a plowman, about a peasant, and how he sort of entails a series of dream visions and an examination to the lives of three allegorical characters known as do well, do better, and do best. So it's a kind of moral, an exhortation to a certain type of moral behavior. And there's some debate over whether what we have is the version that they had. The version that they had might have been a lot more seditious, a lot more questioning of authority. The version we have seems to uphold the values of the feudal system. And we're told that John Ball, a priest involved as leader of the Great Rising, included Piers and other characters in his writings. In Piers Plowman if Piers Plowman had already perceived associations with Lollardy, Ball's appropriations from it, so he includes these in his speeches, had drawn this connection. As I say, we know that the authorities actually issued a warrant for one Piers the Plowman, thinking him a real person. He seems to have been referred to a lot by John Ball in stirring up the peasants. And like I say, I put a lot more in the notes about this, but we think maybe earlier versions of this, and there may have been at least as many as 10, portrayed something perhaps a bit more seditious. In some contemporary chronicles of the peasants' revolt, Ball and the Lollards were blamed for the revolt, and Piers began to be associated with heresy and rebellion. So it may be that it was rewritten because it challenged the social order too much. A highly political text, Piers Plowman. I put a quote from it in here, which again seems to be upholding the status quo. Laborers that have no land to live on, but hire hands, would not deign to dine at night. Old greens, may no penny's ale satisfy them, nor do piece of bacon. But if it be fresh flesh, or fresh fish, or baked, and that served hot and piping hot to prevent their stomachs catching chill. And if he is not highly paid, he will complain and bewail the time that he was born a working man, etc., etc. It seems to be criticizing the people who are trying to improve their lot, but like I say, the version that we have may not be the one that they originally had. So we'll be thinking about these things next time, and looking at the Manciple's tale, the Reeves' tale, and the Shipman's tale. And one thing we're going to get out of the Reeves' tale is a pretty graphic description of what a moderately classed peasant's house was like. And if you look this up in other sources, you'll find it's based heavily on Chaucer's description in the Reeves' tale, because we don't have a lot of descriptions of what their houses were like, and virtually none survive. So we'll get a good look inside secular space from these examples. Thank you very much for your attention. We'll call it quits there.